Why do baby boomers think Gen Z is soft? And why does Gen Z think boomers are emotionally unavailable? Both generations are frustrated. Boomers look at Gen Z and see anxiety, therapy language, job hopping, and constant emotional analysis. Gen Z looks at boomers and sees silence, emotional restraint, and a generation that worked through everything but rarely talked about it. Each side thinks the other one just doesn't get it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Neither side is wrong. They were built for completely different worlds. And psychology isn't about who's tougher. It's about what environment trained your nervous system. Baby boomers were shaped by structured instability. Gen Z was shaped by chaotic instability. Boomers grew up in a world that had real threats: war, economic uncertainty, political upheaval. But it also had clear authority, clear expectations, and stable institutions. Gen Z grew up in a world where the threats never fully turn off: economic shifts, climate anxiety, digital exposure, social comparison. And the institutions themselves feel unstable. So each generation adapted. Boomers learned endurance. Gen Z learned hyper-awareness. And when endurance meets hyper-awareness, it doesn't look like adaptation. It looks like weakness. On both sides. Boomers grew up in physical neighborhoods. If you made a mistake, the people who saw it were local. Neighbors, teachers, family, friends. Your reputation followed you. But only within a few streets. Authority was shared and visible. Adults corrected you directly. Freedom existed, but accountability was immediate. Failure was local. Gen Z grew up in digital neighborhoods. If you made a mistake, it could travel. Classmates weren't just in your classroom. They were online, watching, recording, sharing. Authority isn't just parents or teachers, it's algorithms, comment sections, permanent digital memory. Boomers were watched by neighbors. Gen Z is watched by the internet. And that difference changes how a brain develops. Boomers lived through nuclear drills, assassinations, and cultural revolutions, but the crises were episodic. When the news turned off, life resumed. You went outside, you played. You came home when the streetlights turned on. Fear was real, but it wasn't constant. So they learned something powerful. You can carry fear and still function. Gen Z grew up differently. The news doesn't turn off, notifications don't pause. Global events stream directly into your pocket. Pandemic lockdowns, economic instability, climate warnings, school shootings, not as distant history, but as ongoing headlines. Fear isn't episodic, it's ambient, so they learned something else: stay alert. Boomers learned to endure fear. Gen Z learned to monitor it, and those are not the same skill. Boomers fell publicly. They lost games, missed opportunities, embarrassed themselves, and by the next week, life moved on. There was no archive. Failure hurt, but it faded. Identity stayed mostly separate from mistakes. Gen Z's mistakes don't fade so easily. Screenshots exist. Search history exists. Old posts resurface. Embarrassment can be replayed, not just by a few people, but by anyone. Boomers survived embarrassment. Gen Z survives exposure. When you grow up knowing that mistakes might follow you, you behave differently. You curate, you filter, you protect. Not because you're fake, but because permanence changes risk. For many boomers, work represented stability. If you showed up, worked hard, stayed loyal. The system, more often than not, rewarded you. The contract felt real. It wasn't perfect, but it felt stable enough to trust. Gen Z watched something different. They watched layoffs, watched student debt crush millennials, watched housing prices surge beyond reach. The message wasn't work hard and you'll be fine. The message felt more like nothing is guaranteed. So they adjusted. Flexibility over loyalty, boundaries over burnout, multiple income streams over one lifelong career. Boomers trusted the system. Gen Z saw it crack before they even entered it. That doesn't make one generation committed and the other lazy. It means they evaluated risk differently. This is where the tension feels most personal. Boomers were taught to process emotions internally. Strength meant restraint. You handled it, you didn't announce it. Asking for help often felt unnatural, not because they lacked feelings, but because they were trained to carry them. Gen Z grew up with emotional language, anxiety, boundaries, trauma, self-care. Therapy isn't whispered about, it's normalized. To Gen Z, naming pain is strength. To boomers, constant emotional narration can look like fragility. Boomers were taught to carry it. Gen Z was taught to name it. Neither approach is wrong, but they can feel incompatible. Every survival strategy has a cost. For boomers, endurance can become suppression. Strength can become isolation. Work can replace identity. Rest can feel undeserved. For Gen Z, awareness can become anxiety. Boundaries can become avoidance. Diagnosis can become identity. Discomfort can feel intolerable instead of instructive. One generation risks holding too much inside. The other risks over-identifying with what they feel. Both are trying to stay safe, just in different ways. Here's the deeper truth. Every generation optimizes for survival in the environment it inherits. Boomers optimized for stability through endurance. Gen Z optimized for stability through awareness. One learned, keep going. The other learned, pay attention. What looks like weakness in one generation is often just strength built for a different battlefield. Boomers aren't emotionally empty. They're emotionally disciplined. Gen Z isn't fragile, they're psychologically vigilant. They speak different survival languages. And when we misinterpret survival as character flaw, we miss the entire story. So here's the question. Which survival language do you speak? If you're a boomer, what does Gen Z misunderstand about you? If you're Gen Z, what do boomers get wrong about you? Because maybe the issue isn't toughness, maybe it's translation. And when you understand the environment that shapes someone, you stop asking why they're so different and start asking what they had to survive.